attorney's hands trembled as he broke the wax seal on the envelope. It was July 1854, and the reading of Samuel Whitmore's last will and testament should have been a formality. The man had died 3 weeks earlier at his estate in coastal Georgia, leaving behind a rice empire worth what would be tens of millions in today's money. His widow, Elizabeth Whitmore, sat rigid in her black silk mourning dress, already mentally spending her inheritance. She'd earned it, after all. 23 years of marriage to a man who barely looked at her. 23 years of managing his household, hosting his business associates, bearing his children. 23 years of pretending not to notice where he went on those long evenings when he claimed to be inspecting the millworks. Now finally she would have control. Control of the money, control of the properties, control of her own life for the first time since she was 17 years old. The attorney, a nervous man named Porter Whitfield, cleared his throat. The parlor was crowded. Elizabeth's 2 sons, both in their 20s, leaned forward in their chairs. Samuel's business partner shifted uncomfortably near the window. Several cousins and distant relatives who'd come hoping for scraps sat in the back rows. And standing near the door, as if ready to flee, was a woman who had no business being present at all. Her name was Mary Ann. She was 29 years old. Her skin was the color of warm honey. Her hair fell in dark waves that she'd pinned back severely, and she stood with a stillness that suggested she'd learned long ago how to make herself invisible. She'd been part of the Whitmore household for 14 years, and everyone knew she occupied a position that had no name in polite society. What no one knew, what no one could have possibly imagined, was that in approximately 3 minutes, everything they thought they understood about Samuel Whitmore, about his fortune, about the careful social order they'd all built their lives around, was about to detonate. Porter Whitfield began reading. The opening passages were standard legal language. Then he reached the meat of the document, and his voice faltered. He looked up at Elizabeth, his face pale. "Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps we should discuss this privately first." "Read it," Elizabeth said coldly. "Whatever my husband has done, I will hear it in front of witnesses." What she heard would destroy her. Every word the attorney spoke landed like a physical blow. The entirety of Marsh Grove Plantation, all 7,000 acres of it, with its rice fields that produced a fortune every harvest. The townhouse in Savannah with its imported furniture and crystal chandeliers. The shares in 3 shipping companies. The bank accounts that could support a family in luxury for generations. All of it, every single piece of Samuel Whitmore's vast wealth, was left to Mary Ann. Not to his wife, not to his sons, to a woman who, according to the law of Georgia in 1854, wasn't even a person. She was property. And now, somehow, she owned everything. But before we continue with what happened when that will was read aloud, when 23 years of careful lies came crashing down in a single afternoon, make sure you're following the sealed room. This is exactly the kind of buried American story we uncover. The histories that were deliberately erased because they revealed truths too uncomfortable for the history books to handle. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because these stories don't tell themselves, and the powerful families who tried to bury them are counting on you never hearing what really happened. Now, let's go back to that parlor in Savannah, to the moment everything changed. Elizabeth Whitmore didn't scream. She didn't faint, though several of the women in the back of the room did. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face blank as marble. It was her son James who exploded first. He lunged from his chair, his face purple with rage. "This is impossible! It's fraud! That woman has no legal standing to inherit anything." "The document is properly executed," Whitfield said weakly. "I witnessed it myself along with 2 other attorneys. Your father was of sound mind when he dictated these terms." "Sound mind?" James's voice cracked. "He left his entire fortune to his... He couldn't even finish the sentence. His brother Thomas put a hand on his arm. Thomas was quieter, more calculating. His voice when he spoke was ice. "When was this will written?" 3 months before your father's death. "April 1854. And did our father explain his reasoning?" Whitfield hesitated. This was the part he'd been dreading most. He left a letter to be read after the will. He instructed me to read it aloud to all assembled. "Then read it," Elizabeth said. Her voice had gone flat, emotionless. She'd already left her body, already retreated to some interior space where the words couldn't touch her. It was a trick she'd learned years ago, in the early years of her marriage, when she'd first understood what kind of man she'd married. The letter was written in Samuel's own hand, bold and clear. There was no weakness in it, no apology. To my family, it began. If you are hearing this, I am dead, and you are learning that I have left everything to Marianne. You will call this madness. You will call it betrayal. You will fight it in every court in Georgia. Let me save you the trouble of wondering why, and let me give you the truth I was too cowardly to speak while I lived. Marianne is not what you think she is. She is not some woman I purchased and used for my pleasure, though I know that is what Charleston society believed. Marianne is Marianne Cheswick. We met in 1835 when she was 14 and I was 22. Her father was Thomas Cheswick, a ship's carpenter who did work for my father's company. She was beautiful and brilliant, and I loved her from the moment I saw her. We courted in secret for 2 years because I knew my family would never accept her. Her mother was a free woman of color from Charleston, and in my family's eyes that made Marianne unsuitable. No matter that she was educated, no matter that she could quote Shakespeare and discuss philosophy, no matter that she made me feel fully alive for the first time in my life, I was weak. I was a coward. When my father discovered our attachment in 1837, he gave me a choice. Marry Elizabeth Rutledge, whose family connections would benefit our business, or be cut off entirely. I chose money over love. I chose comfort over courage. I married Elizabeth in 1838, and I thought I would forget Marianne, thought I would build a life that made sense according to the rules I'd been raised with. But I couldn't forget her. I searched for her for 3 years. I found her in 1840, in circumstances so horrific that I still wake in the night thinking of them. After I'd abandoned her, she'd faced social ruin. Her mother had died. With no resources and no protection, she'd been targeted by slave catchers who forged papers claiming she'd been someone's runaway property. This happened all the time to free people of color, especially women who were alone and vulnerable. She'd been sold at auction in Charleston, sold, like livestock, and transported to a plantation in South Carolina where she'd spent 2 years being brutalized in ways I will not describe in this letter. I bought her freedom. Or I thought I did. I paid an extraordinary sum to purchase her from that plantation, and I brought her to Marsh Grove. But I didn't free her, not legally. I told myself it was for her protection, that a free woman of color would be vulnerable in Georgia. The truth was, I was still a coward. I wanted her near me, but I wasn't brave enough to face society's judgment if I acknowledged her as what she really was. So I kept her in a category the law recognized. I kept her enslaved while telling myself I was saving her. For 14 years, she has lived in my household. She has managed every aspect of my business because she has twice the mind for numbers that I ever had. She has kept my accounts, corresponded with my factors, advised me on investments that made me wealthy beyond my father's dreams. She has done all this while living under the constant threat that if I died, if I lost interest, if I simply woke up one day and decided I was done with her, she could be sold to settle debts or given away to relatives as part of an estate settlement. She has borne me 3 children. Not by choice, not at first, because how can any woman truly choose when the man has the legal right to sell her tomorrow? But over time, something grew between us that I do not have words to name. It was not the marriage I had with Elizabeth, which was a business arrangement disguised as a sacrament. It was not simple lust, though I will not pretend desire played no role. It was recognition. She saw who I actually was beneath the performance I gave to Charleston society. And somehow, impossibly, she did not turn away. My children with Marianne are named Grace, Hope, and Samuel Jr. They are 10, 8, and 5 years old. They have lived their entire lives on this plantation, technically enslaved by their own father, their existence unacknowledged except in the privacy of my own quarters. Grace can read in 3 languages. Hope has a gift for music that makes angels weep. Samuel can recite entire passages of Virgil from memory. They are extraordinary children who should never have been born into bondage. James and Thomas, my sons with Elizabeth, have been raised with every advantage. They have been educated. They have been introduced to society. They have the protection of their mother's family name and the security of being white men in Georgia. They need no inheritance from me to thrive in this world. Every door is already open to them. Grace, Hope, and Samuel Jr. have nothing but what I can give them. Without my intervention, they remain enslaved. Without legal protection, they can be sold to anyone, to endure anything. So I give them everything. I give them the plantation, the houses, the money, everything, held in trust by their mother until they come of age. I have commissioned documents, separate from this will, that grant Marianne and the children their freedom upon my death. These documents have been filed in 3 separate locations to ensure they cannot be destroyed. Marianne knows where they are. She has copies. She has the names of attorneys in the North who will defend her rights if challenged. Elizabeth, I know you will hate me for this. You have every right to. I stole 23 years of your life. I married you knowing I loved another woman. I gave you children while maintaining another family in the same house. I made you complicit in a lie you didn't even know you were telling. I turned you into the villain of someone else's love story, and that was unforgivably cruel. But I will not apologize for trying to free my own children. I will not apologize for giving Marianne the means to protect herself and them after I'm gone. What I did in life was monstrous. Let my death at least serve some small measure of justice. If you contest this will, everything will become public. Every detail of my relationship with Marianne. Every piece of evidence that she was a free woman whom I essentially kidnapped into slavery through legal manipulation. Every record of the children I acknowledged privately, but refused to protect publicly. I do not think you want that scrutiny, Elizabeth. I do not think you want Charleston to examine how many other men in your social circle are doing exactly what I did. But if you force this into court, that is what will happen. Marianne, if you are hearing this, then I am gone, and you are finally free. I am sorry it took my death to make it so. I am sorry for every day I was too weak to do this while I could still see your face when you heard the news. I loved you. I love you still, wherever I am now. Protect our children. Build the life I should have given you 20 years ago. To everyone else in this room, I say only this. The system that made this situation possible is evil. A society that allows men to own other human beings, to own their own children, to buy and sell people like property, is beyond reform. It will burn. I will not live to see it burn, but you will. And when it does, perhaps somewhere in the ashes, people like Marianne and our children will finally be allowed to exist as fully human. I die knowing I failed to be the man I should have been. But at least I die having told the truth. Samuel Whitmore, April 1854. The silence after the letter's reading was total. No one moved. No one breathed. Marianne, standing by the door, had tears streaming down her face, but she made no sound. Elizabeth stood. She moved with the careful precision of someone who knows that if she loses control for even an instant, she will shatter completely. She walked to where Marianne stood and stopped directly in front of her. They were nearly the same height. For the first time in 14 years, they looked directly at each other without any pretense between them. "Did you love him?" Elizabeth asked. Marianne met her eyes. "I don't know what I felt anymore. I loved who he was when we were young. I hated him for abandoning me. I was grateful he bought me before I died on that plantation. I resented him for not freeing me when he could have. I respected his mind. I despised his cowardice. He gave me children, and he enslaved those children. How do you name what you feel for someone who saves you and imprisons you in the same act?" Elizabeth nodded slowly, as if this answer made a terrible kind of sense. "I hated him," she said quietly. "I hated him from the moment I understood he would never love me. I hated him for making me live a lie. I hated him for giving you what I wanted. And I hate him most of all for this, for dying and leaving me with nothing while you get everything. I never wanted to take anything from you," Marianne said. "You took my husband. He was never yours to lose." The truth of it hung between them. Elizabeth had never had Samuel's heart, had never even had his attention except as a social obligation. She'd been given the title of wife and the appearance of respect, but the substance of the man had always belonged elsewhere. "I will fight this," Elizabeth said. "I will take this to every court in Georgia. I will spend everything I have left to see you destroyed. Then you'll lose what little remains to you," Marianne said. Her voice was steady now, stronger. "Samuel made sure this will is legally bulletproof. He spent 3 months with attorneys constructing it. He knew you would fight. He wanted you to understand that fighting would only make everything worse. He wanted to punish me for not being you." "No," Marianne said gently. "He wanted to free his children. You just happened to be in the way." Elizabeth turned and walked from the room. Her sons followed, James still sputtering with rage, Thomas quiet and calculating, already planning the legal strategy that would dominate the next 2 years of all their lives. The other relatives filed out, whispering, scandalized, thrilled at the gossip they'd just witnessed. Only the attorney remained, gathering his papers, his hands still shaking. "Miss Marianne," he said quietly, "I have the freedom papers. They're filed in 3 locations as Mr. Whitmore specified. You are legally free as of the moment of his death." She nodded. 14 years of being property, erased in an instant by a man's death. She'd learned not to trust such easy transformations. "There will be challenges," Whitfield continued. "Mrs. Whitmore's attorneys will argue that you exercised undue influence. They'll argue that you manipulated Mr. Whitmore while he was ill. He wasn't ill. He died suddenly of a stroke. They'll argue it anyway. They'll argue anything they can. You should prepare yourself. This will get ugly." Marianne looked around the parlor, at the expensive furniture Samuel had purchased, at the paintings on the walls, at the crystal chandelier overhead catching the afternoon light. She'd cleaned this room 1,000 times. She'd served drinks to Samuel's business associates in this room. She'd stood silent in the corner during parties, holding the coats, fetching the refreshments, being invisible while they discussed business and politics and the best methods for controlling enslaved workers, as if she weren't even human enough to be offended by the conversation. Now it was hers. All of it, and she had absolutely no idea if she was strong enough to keep it. The first attack came within 48 hours. Elizabeth's attorneys filed a motion in Savannah Superior Court challenging the will on 5 separate grounds: undue influence, testamentary incapacity, fraud, violation of Georgia law regarding property transfer to persons of color. And most creatively, they argued that since Marianne had been enslaved at the time the will was written, she had no legal standing to accept the inheritance because property cannot own property. It was that last argument that revealed how desperate they were, but also how dangerous. The legal logic was circular and insane, but it had the weight of precedent behind it. Georgia law in 1854 was a labyrinth of contradictions when it came to enslaved people who'd been freed. The state had been tightening restrictions for years, terrified of the growing free black population. Any excuse to void a manumission, any technicality that could return a free person to bondage, was enthusiastically embraced by courts that existed to protect white property interests above all else. Marianne retained 3 attorneys. The first was Jonathan Hayes, a Savannah lawyer who'd built his career defending property rights and saw the Whitmore case as legally fascinating regardless of its moral implications. The second was Robert Gill, who'd studied law in Massachusetts and returned to Georgia with dangerously progressive ideas about human rights. The third was Solomon Wright, a free man of color who'd purchased his own freedom in 1840 and who'd taught himself law because no institution would admit him. Wright couldn't argue in court. Georgia law forbade it. But his knowledge of the specific statutes designed to control free black people made him invaluable. They met in Hayes's office 3 days after the will was read. Marianne brought her children, Grace, Hope, and Samuel Jr. She refused to leave them at Marsh Grove unprotected. Not when everyone on the plantation was suddenly uncertain about who had authority, who could be trusted, who might try to kidnap 3 valuable children and sell them before the legal situation clarified. Grace was 10 years old and understood exactly what was happening. She sat with her hands folded, her face carefully neutral, a miniature version of her mother's survival mask. Hope, 8, kept looking around the law office with wide eyes, taking in the books, the papers, the maps on the walls. Samuel Jr., 5, sat close to his mother, his thumb in his mouth despite being too old for it, regressed by the stress he could feel but not fully understand. "The freedom papers are solid," Hayes said, spreading documents across his desk. Samuel filed them in 3 jurisdictions. Here in Savannah, in Charleston where he originally purchased you, and in Philadelphia with a law firm that specializes in these cases. Even if Georgia courts try to void them, you have recourse through federal channels and northern courts. You are legally free and so are your children. But, Marianne said, because she could hear the hesitation in his voice, but the inheritance is more complicated. Georgia has laws limiting what free people of color can inherit. Nothing explicitly prevents this transfer, but the amounts involved are so extraordinary that the court has discretion to rule it against public policy. They can decide that allowing you to inherit this much wealth threatens the social order. Threatens the social order, Marianne repeated. By which you mean it frightens white people to imagine a woman who looks like me controlling property that was built on the backs of people who look like me. Hayes had the grace to look uncomfortable. Yes, that's exactly what I mean. Robert Gill leaned forward. There's another problem. The plantation itself. Marshgrove currently has 240 people living on it in bondage. Under the terms of the will, you now legally own those people. The weight of that statement filled the room like smoke. Marianne had known it intellectually, had understood it from the moment the will was read. But hearing it stated plainly made it real in a way she'd been avoiding. She'd been enslaved herself until 3 days ago. Now she owned other human beings. The system was so corrupt, so twisted, that the only way to escape it was to become complicit in it. Samuel included a clause, she said quietly, in a separate document. He wanted me to free them all, gradually, in a way that wouldn't bankrupt the estate or draw legal challenges. He knew mass manumission would be blocked by the state. He was right, Wright said. His voice was measured, careful. Georgia law requires legislative approval for freeing more than 5 people at a time. You'd need to petition the state government, and they'd never approve freeing 240 people at once. They'd see it as encouraging servile insurrection. You'd lose everything, and the people you're trying to free would simply be sold to someone else. So I have to keep them enslaved to eventually free them, Marianne said. I have to become what was done to me in order to undo it. Yes, Wright said. There was no comfort in his honesty. Grace spoke up then, her young voice cutting through the adult conversation. What about the rice? What happens to the harvest? All the attorneys looked at her surprised. She met their gazes steadily. If the plantation doesn't function, it can't make money. If it can't make money, it can't pay its debts. If it can't pay its debts, it gets sold at auction, which means Mother loses everything and we all end up enslaved again, possibly to people who won't care about gradual manumission or legal challenges or any of it. So what happens to the rice harvest? Hayes blinked. That's actually the most immediate problem, yes. The harvest is in 3 weeks. The rice needs to be collected, processed, shipped to factors in Charleston. The entire year's income depends on that harvest. And right now, there's no clear authority at Marshgrove. The overseer is refusing to take orders from Miss Marianne. The workers don't know who's in charge. The whole operation is on the verge of collapse. Then I need to go back to Marshgrove, Marianne said, and make it very clear who's in charge. Jill shook his head. That's dangerous. You'd be isolated on a plantation with people who resent you. An overseer who doesn't recognize your authority, and no legal protection if someone decides to simply ignore the freedom papers and claim you never had them. I've lived at Marshgrove for 14 years, Marianne said. I know every person on that property. I know who can be trusted and who can't. I know the rice operation better than Samuel did because I'm the one who actually kept the books, who knew which fields were producing, which irrigation systems needed repair, which factors in Charleston were honest and which would cheat us on weights and measures. I can run that plantation. I just need the law to stand behind me while I do it. The law, Wright said quietly, has never stood behind someone like you. Not in Georgia. Not in any southern state. Then I'll be the first, Marianne said. The steel in her voice surprised even her. She returned to Marshgrove the next morning with her children and 2 hired men who'd been instructed to serve as bodyguards, though everyone understood how little protection they could actually provide if things went wrong. The plantation sat 15 miles outside Savannah along the river, 7,000 acres of rice fields carved from swampland through decades of brutal labor. The main house was smaller than people expected when they heard about Samuel Whitmore's wealth. He'd built his fortune on production, not display. The house was functional, sturdy, 2 stories of plain brick with wide porches designed for the heat, not beauty. When Marianne's carriage came up the drive, people stopped working. They stood in the fields, in the yards, along the paths, watching. Word had spread in the way news always spread through enslaved communities, fast and detailed and often more accurate than what white people believed. Everyone knew Samuel Whitmore had died. Everyone knew his will had left everything to Marianne. Everyone knew there was going to be a fight. What no one knew yet was whether Marianne surviving that fight would mean anything good for them, or whether this was just a different kind of master taking control. The overseer, a man named Garrett Cole, waited on the front porch with his arms crossed. He was 40 years old, mean in the casual way that men got when they had absolute power over people who couldn't fight back. Samuel had kept him on because he knew rice and kept production high, not because he was decent. Marianne had hated him for 14 years. Now she had to either control him or replace him, and both options were dangerous. Miss Marianne, he said as she climbed down from the carriage. He didn't use any other title, didn't acknowledge her legal status. I'm surprised to see you back. Thought you might have run north with your children and whatever you could carry. This is my property now, Mr. Cole. I'm here to manage it. He smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. That so? Well, I got a letter this morning from Mrs. Whitmore's attorneys. They say the will is being contested. They say I shouldn't take any orders from you until the court sorts out who actually owns what. They say if I follow your instructions, I might be held liable for any losses that occur. Marianne had expected this. Elizabeth was moving on multiple fronts simultaneously, using the legal challenge to create uncertainty, using that uncertainty to undermine Marianne's authority, trying to make the plantation collapse so the court would have justification to void the will based on incompetent management. The court hasn't voided anything, Marianne said. Until it does, the will stands. I own Marshgrove. You work for me. The harvest is in 3 weeks. Are you going to help bring it in, or do I need to find someone who will? Cole's smile faded. You threatening to fire me? I'm asking if you plan to do your job. He looked past her at the 2 bodyguards, measuring them. Then he looked at the people who'd gathered in the yard, listening. He was calculating, she realized. Calculating whether he could simply ignore her, whether the workers would follow his lead or hers, whether Elizabeth's attorneys could actually protect him if he refused to acknowledge Marianne's authority. The harvest comes in regardless, he said finally. Been doing this for 20 years? Don't need instructions from someone who was emptying chamber pots last week. The insult was deliberate, designed to humiliate her in front of the workers. Marianne felt the anger rise in her chest, hot and dangerous. She forced it down. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. I kept Samuel's books for 10 years, Mr. Cole. I know exactly how much this plantation produces and how much it costs to produce it. I know that the factors in Charleston pay 6 cents per pound for good rice and 3 cents for broken rice. I know that you've been reporting production numbers that are 15% lower than what actually ships. And I know you have an arrangement with a factor named Vernon Mills who accepts the missing 15% at reduced rates and splits the profit with you. I know you've been stealing from this estate for at least 7 years, probably longer. Samuel knew too, but he tolerated it because you're good at your job, and 15% was an acceptable cost for reliable management. Cole's face had gone white, then red. I'm not Samuel, Marianne continued. I can't afford to tolerate 15% losses while I'm fighting for this estate in court. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to bring in this harvest honestly. Every pound is going to be accounted for. You're going to accept that I own this property and you work for me. And if you do that, if you do your job well and help me prove to the court that this plantation can function under my management, then I'll consider your past thefts a matter between you and Samuel, and we'll start fresh. But if you undermine me, if you sabotage the harvest, if you continue stealing, or if you encourage the workers to resist my authority, I'll have you prosecuted for theft and fraud. And I have documentary evidence going back 7 years that will put you in prison. The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone in the yard was watching now, understanding that they were witnessing a shift in power, a moment where the established order either held or broke. Cole stared at her. She could see him working through it. He probably hadn't thought she knew about the theft. He'd assumed she was just Samuel's mistress, just a woman who'd gotten lucky. He hadn't anticipated that she'd actually been running the business side of the plantation, that she knew where the money went, that she had records. I'll bring in the harvest, he said finally. His voice was tight with rage, but he was saying the words. But when the court voids that will, and it will, don't expect mercy from Mrs. Whitmore. She'll have you sold before the sun sets. If the court voids the will, Marianne said, mercy will be the least of my concerns. Until then, we have rice to harvest. I want production reports on my desk every evening, and I'll be reviewing them against the factor receipts. Are we clear? Clear. Good. Now get back to work. Cole left, and the crowd slowly dispersed. Marianne stood on the porch of the house she now owned, watching her property, which included the people walking away from her across the yard, and she felt the weight of what Samuel had done to her settle across her shoulders like iron chains disguised as gold. That evening, after her children were asleep in the bedroom that had been Samuel's, the bedroom she'd rarely been allowed to enter when he was alive, and that was now hers by legal right, there was a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find an older woman named Ruth standing there. Ruth was in her 60s, had been at Marshgrove longer than anyone else, had seen overseers come and go and masters change and children born into bondage and sold away. She looked at Marianne with eyes that had witnessed more cruelty than should be possible in a single lifetime. "We need to talk," Ruth said. "About what happens next." Marianne let her in. They sat together in the room where Samuel had slept, where he'd made decisions about buying and selling human beings, where he'd counted his money and planned his future and died suddenly without warning, leaving behind chaos. "People are scared," Ruth said. "They heard about the will. They heard you might free everyone eventually. They heard Mrs. Whitmore is fighting it and might win. They don't know what to hope for anymore. Hope is dangerous. It gets people killed." "I know," Marianne said. "Do you?" Ruth leaned forward. "You were enslaved for 2 years. I've been enslaved for 63. You know what 2 years of fear feels like. You don't know what a lifetime of it does to people. These people have survived by not hoping, by not trusting promises, by assuming every white person's word is a lie, and every situation will get worse. You come in here saying you're going to free them eventually, and they don't believe you. Why should they? You're standing in the master's house giving orders just like any other master." "I was one of them," Marianne said. "I was property just like they are." "You were property for 2 years, Ruth said. "Then you became the master's woman. You got to live in the house. You got to wear decent clothes. You got to educate your children. You stopped being one of us the moment Samuel Whitmore decided you were special. And now you own us. You might have good intentions, girl, but you own us. And that makes you exactly like every other owner, no matter what color your skin is." The truth of it was devastating. Marianne had no answer that wouldn't sound like justification or excuse. "I can't free everyone at once," she finally said. "The law won't allow it. But I can make conditions better while I work toward manumission. I can stop the worst abuses. I can keep families together. I can pay wages instead of just providing rations so people can save money. I can teach reading despite it being illegal, because who's going to stop me? I can do something, even if I can't do everything." Ruth studied her face for a long moment. "And when Mrs. Whitmore wins in court? When you lose everything and get sold yourself? What happens to those promises then?" "Then I'll have failed," Marianne said simply. "But I'm going to fight like hell to make sure that doesn't happen." Ruth nodded slowly. "All right then. I'll tell people you're serious. I'll tell them to give you a chance. But know this. If you betray that trust, if you turn out to be just another master with prettier words, there won't be anywhere in Georgia you can hide." People remember betrayals. They remember for generations. "I know," Marianne said. "I'll remember too." Ruth left, and Marianne sat alone in Samuel's bedroom, in her bedroom now, and wondered if it was possible to wield power justly when that power itself was unjust. If you could free people you owned without first acknowledging that owning them made you complicit in their bondage. If redemption was even possible inside a system designed to corrupt every good intention, she didn't have answers. All she had was 3 children sleeping in the next room who needed her to be strong, and 240 people whose lives depended on her navigating an impossible situation without making it worse. The harvest came in. The rice went to Charleston. The factors paid honestly because Marianne had warned them she was watching. The estate made money. It was proof that Marsh Grove could function under her management, which meant Elizabeth's attorneys had to shift their strategy. If they couldn't argue incompetence, they'd argue morality. They'd argue that Georgia law couldn't allow this kind of wealth transfer because it threatened the social order itself. They'd make the case about more than one woman and one will. They'd make it about the survival of the world they'd built, and the battle was just beginning. The case went to trial in October 1854, 4 months after Samuel's death. The courtroom in Savannah was packed beyond capacity. People stood in the aisles, crowded the doorways, pressed against the windows from outside. This wasn't just a probate dispute anymore. This was theater. This was a public examination of questions that polite society usually kept locked behind closed doors. Judge Marcus Caldwell presided. He was 58 years old, a plantation owner himself, a man whose entire life had been built on the assumptions that Elizabeth's attorneys were defending. But he was also known for being scrupulously fair within the bounds of law, which meant he couldn't simply dismiss the case on grounds of personal distaste. He had to actually rule on the legal merits, and that meant both sides would get to present their evidence in full. Elizabeth's lead attorney was a man named Silas Morehouse, one of the most respected lawyers in Georgia. He opened with a statement designed to appeal not to law, but to fear. Your Honor, this case is about more than one estate or one will. It's about whether we will allow the fundamental order of our society to be overturned by the sentimental impulses of dying men. Samuel Whitmore was, by all accounts, a decent man who built a successful business through hard work and sound judgment. But in his final months, he fell victim to manipulation by a woman who had every incentive to secure her own future at the expense of his legitimate family. We will prove that Marianne, regardless of what papers claim about her status, exercised undue influence over Mr. Whitmore during a period when he was increasingly isolated and vulnerable. We will prove that the will was written under circumstances that cast serious doubt on its validity, and we will prove that allowing this inheritance to stand would set a precedent that threatens every family in Georgia who employs people in their household. The implication was clear. If Marianne could inherit, then any enslaved woman could potentially manipulate her way into a fortune. Every white family with a complex household suddenly had reason to worry. It was brilliant legal strategy because it made every wealthy man in the courtroom see himself in Samuel Whitmore's position, see their own carefully managed secrets potentially exposed. Jonathan Hayes stood for the defense. His opening was more direct. Your Honor, this case is simple. Samuel Whitmore wrote a valid will while in full possession of his faculties. He had every legal right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. The only reason we're here is because his choice offends the sensibilities of people who believe that certain kinds of human beings shouldn't be allowed to own property. But our personal feelings about who deserves what have no bearing on the law. The law says a man can leave his property to whomever he chooses, with very limited exceptions. Mrs. Whitmore has her dower rights, which the will respects. Beyond that, Mr. Whitmore's testamentary wishes are clear and legally binding. The question before this court isn't whether we like his decision. It's whether we will honor a man's dying wishes or let social prejudice override explicit legal rights. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Morehouse called witness after witness designed to paint Marianne as a schemer who'd seduced and manipulated Samuel. He called former business associates who testified about changes in Samuel's behavior in his final years, how he'd become more withdrawn, how he'd spent more time at Marshgrove and less time in Savannah society. He called Elizabeth herself to the stand, and her testimony was devastating in its controlled rage. "I gave that man 23 years of my life," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "I bore his children. I managed his household. I stood beside him through business difficulties and family tragedies. I did everything a wife should do, and my reward for that devotion was to discover that he'd been keeping another family under my own roof, spending my dower money on another woman's children, planning to leave me destitute while he provided for his mistress. He didn't just betray our marriage vows. He destroyed our children's future to satisfy his own guilty conscience." Hayes cross-examined gently, understanding that attacking Elizabeth too hard would only generate sympathy for her. "Mrs. Whitmore, when did you first learn about your husband's relationship with Marianne?" "At the reading of the will." "You had no suspicion before then? In 14 years, you never noticed anything unusual about her position in the household?" Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "I am not on trial here, Mr. Hayes. I'm simply trying to understand the dynamics of the household." "Did you and your husband discuss Marianne's role?" "She was property. There was nothing to discuss. But she managed significant aspects of the estate, correct? She kept the books, corresponded with factors, made business decisions, under my husband's direction. Did you ever review those books yourself? Did you involve yourself in the business operations?" "That was not my role. I managed the household. Samuel managed the business. So you trusted him to make sound business decisions, obviously. But now you're arguing that in making his final business decision, the disposition of his estate, he was incompetent or manipulated." Morehouse objected, and the judge sustained it, but the point had been made. Elizabeth couldn't have it both ways. Either Samuel was competent to run a business empire, in which case his will should be honored, or he wasn't, in which case Elizabeth should have noticed his declining capacity years earlier. But the most explosive testimony came when Morehouse called Garrett Cole, the overseer, to testify about Marianne's behavior after Samuel's death. Cole described the confrontation on the porch, Marianne's accusations about his theft, her threats to prosecute him if he didn't comply with her authority. He described it as proof of her grasping nature, her willingness to use any means necessary to secure power. "She had documentation," Cole said, "going back years. Records of production numbers, factor receipts, shipping manifests. She'd been keeping track of everything, building evidence. That's not the behavior of someone who was just a passive victim. That's someone who was planning, calculating, waiting for her opportunity. Hayes stood for cross-examination, and his voice was ice. "Mr. Cole, were you stealing from the Whitmore estate?" "I object to the characterization," Morehouse said quickly. "Sustained," Judge Caldwell said. "Rephrase, Mr. Hayes. Mr. Cole, were your production reports to Mr. Whitmore accurate?" Cole shifted in his seat. "They were estimates. Estimates that consistently reported 15% less rice than actually shipped to factors. The rice business involves losses. Broken grain, spillage, rats. 15% losses every single year for 7 years. That seems remarkably consistent for something as variable as spillage and pest damage. That's agriculture." Hayes produced a ledger. "This is the estate's record of factor payments. Would you like to review it and tell the court whether the amounts match what you reported as shipped?" Cole looked at the ledger and his face went red. He'd been caught, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. "Mr. Whitmore never questioned my numbers," he said finally. "Because he tolerated your theft as the cost of reliable management," Hayes said. "Miss Marianne told you she couldn't afford that tolerance while fighting for the estate." "She wasn't grasping for power. She was trying to stop you from stealing during a vulnerable period. The fact that she had documentation proves she was doing her job, the job Mr. Whitmore had given her, managing the business side of the estate. The testimony damaged Elizabeth's case. But it also revealed something uncomfortable for Marianne's side. It showed that she'd been functioning as Samuel's business partner for years, which raised questions about the true nature of their relationship. If she was competent enough to catch financial fraud and manage complex agricultural operations, could she really be considered property in any meaningful sense? And if she wasn't really property, then what had Samuel actually been doing all those years? Morehouse used this in his closing argument. The defense wants you to believe that Miss Marianne was helpless, that she had no agency, that she was simply a victim of circumstances. But the evidence shows someone who was intelligent, educated, capable of sophisticated business operations, capable of keeping detailed records and planning years in advance. This doesn't sound like a victim. This sounds like someone who saw an opportunity and took it. Mr. Whitmore was isolated, increasingly dependent on her for managing his affairs, and she used that dependence to secure her position. By the time he wrote that will, she'd made herself indispensable. That's not love. That's strategy. The argument was clever because it acknowledged Marianne's competence while using that competence against her. She was too smart, too capable to be an innocent victim. Therefore, she must be a manipulator. It ignored the reality that she'd needed to be competent to survive, that intelligence in a woman in her position was a defense mechanism, not evidence of scheming. But it resonated with the jury because it gave them permission to dismiss the uncomfortable questions about how enslaved people could be intelligent, capable human beings while still being treated as property. Hayes's closing argument addressed this directly. Opposing counsel wants you to believe that Miss Marianne's competence proves she manipulated Mr. Whitmore. I would suggest it proves the opposite. Samuel Whitmore was a successful businessman who built a fortune through sound judgment. When he needed someone to manage his books, coordinate his shipping, track his finances, he chose someone with the intelligence and education to do the job well. He recognized her ability and he used it. That's not manipulation. That's collaboration, and yes, over 14 years. Working closely with her, depending on her, raising children with her, something developed between them that went beyond a simple master-slave relationship. The law may have defined her as property, but Samuel Whitmore knew she was a person. He knew his children with her were human beings, not livestock. And when he faced his own mortality, he chose to acknowledge that truth legally, even knowing it would cost him his reputation and his family's goodwill. Was that decision influenced by his relationship with Miss Marianne? Of course it was. Every testamentary decision is influenced by our relationships. That's not undue influence. That's called being human. The question before this court is whether we will honor a man's clear, legally executed wishes, or whether we will let prejudice and social pressure override the law itself. Judge Caldwell took 2 weeks to issue his ruling. When the court reconvened in early November, the courtroom was even more packed than during the trial. The judge looked tired, like a man who'd spent those 2 weeks wrestling with questions that had no good answers. His ruling was careful, technical, focused on narrow legal grounds rather than the broader moral questions. This court finds that Samuel Whitmore's will was properly executed according to Georgia law. The evidence does not support claims of testamentary incapacity or undue influence rising to the level that would void the document. However, this court also recognizes that the bequest raises significant questions about public policy and the transfer of property to persons who were, at the time of the bequest's creation, held in bondage. After careful review of Georgia statutes regarding property rights and manumission, this court finds that the freedom papers executed for Miss Mary Ann and her children are valid. They are, as of Mr. Whitmore's death, free persons of color under Georgia law. As free persons, they have limited rights to own property, with certain restrictions designed to protect public order. This court therefore rules as follows: the will stands. Miss Mary Ann and her children are recognized as free persons and as the legal beneficiaries of Samuel Whitmore's estate. However, the transfer of real property, specifically Marshgrove Plantation, is subject to the restriction that it cannot be sold or transferred without the approval of this court for a period of 10 years. This restriction is designed to ensure stability and prevent speculation. Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore's dower rights are confirmed, and she is entitled to reside at Marshgrove or receive the monetary equivalent of those rights at her election. The remainder of the estate passes to Miss Mary Ann as specified in the will. The courtroom erupted. Elizabeth's attorneys immediately filed notice of appeal. Hayes began preparing for the next phase of litigation. But underneath all the legal maneuvering, the fundamental question had been answered. Mary Ann had won. The will stood. Elizabeth chose to take the monetary equivalent of her dower rights rather than remain at Marshgrove. The amount was substantial, enough to support her comfortably for the rest of her life, though nothing like the fortune she'd expected to inherit. She left Savannah within a month, moving to Charleston to live with relatives. She never spoke publicly about the case again, but she also never stopped fighting it legally. The appeals would continue for another 18 months before finally being exhausted. Mary Ann remained at Marshgrove. She'd won the legal battle, but the harder work was just beginning. She had to figure out how to run a plantation that was founded on enslaved labor while working toward ending that labor. She had to manage an agricultural operation in an economy that was about to collapse. She had to raise 3 children who were legally free but socially unacceptable in Georgia society. She had to navigate a world that had no category for someone like her, a formerly enslaved woman who now owned the plantation she'd served on. The contradictions were unsustainable, and she knew it. But she'd bought time to free people gradually, time to prepare for the catastrophe she could feel coming. Because in 1854, anyone paying attention could sense that the system was breaking. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had just passed. Bleeding Kansas would start soon, and the careful compromises that had held the nation together were unraveling. Mary Ann had 6 years before everything burned. She intended to use them well. That winter, she began the process of manumission. 5 people at a time, the legal maximum without requiring legislative approval. She chose the oldest first, people who'd given their lives to building the plantation and deserved to die free. She provided them with papers, with money, with the option to stay on as paid workers, or to leave and build lives elsewhere. Some stayed, some left. All of them carried with them the knowledge that freedom had come from one of their own. Someone who'd been enslaved just like them, and who'd somehow managed to transform that experience into power. By the time the war came in 1861, Mary Ann had freed 93 people. She would have freed more, but the state grew increasingly restrictive as tensions escalated, and after Fort Sumter, manumission became nearly impossible. The remaining people on Marshgrove would have to wait for Union troops to arrive, and that wouldn't happen until 1864. But Mary Ann had done what she could. She'd used the fortune Samuel left her not to become a plantation mistress in the traditional sense, but to dismantle the plantation from within. Slowly, carefully, legally, she'd been pulling apart the system that had enslaved her, freeing people one small group at a time, teaching reading in secret, paying wages, keeping families together, doing everything the law allowed and some things it didn't. Samuel Whitmore had given her the means to do this. Whether that made him a hero or just a slightly less monstrous participant in an evil system remained an open question. He'd enslaved his own children, but he'd also freed them. He'd kept Mary Ann in bondage while claiming to love her. but he'd also tried to give her the power to escape that bondage after his death. He'd participated in a system of brutal oppression, but he'd also tried to undermine it from within in the only way he knew how. There are no clean stories in history this dark. No heroes without compromise. No justice without cost. Only people trying to navigate impossible situations, making choices that are never simple, living with consequences that ripple forward through generations. When the war finally came in April 1861, Marianne knew exactly what it meant. She'd been preparing for it since 1854, quietly converting assets to forms that could survive economic collapse. She'd sold off Samuel's shipping company shares before they became worthless. She'd moved money to banks in Philadelphia and New York. She'd reduced the plantation's dependence on rice monoculture, diversifying into food crops that could feed people rather than generate export income. She'd done everything possible to ensure that when the system collapsed, and she knew it would collapse, her children would survive. Grace was 17 when Fort Sumter fell. She'd been educated in secret by tutors Marianne hired quietly, teachers who came from the North and asked no questions about why a woman of color was paying them to teach her daughter Latin and mathematics and literature. Grace was brilliant, frighteningly so, the kind of mind that should have gone to university but couldn't because no university in America would admit a young woman of mixed race, no matter how qualified. She understood what the war meant better than most adults. She understood that their legal freedom meant nothing if the Confederacy won, that everything her mother had fought for could be erased by a single lost battle. Hope was 15, quieter than her sister, with her father's gift for numbers and her mother's steel. She'd been helping Marianne manage the plantation's finances since she was 12, keeping ledgers that were more accurate than most professional bookkeepers could manage. She looked at the war as an accounting problem. The South had less population, less industry, less money. The math didn't work. It would lose eventually. The only question was how long it would take and how much would be destroyed in the process. Samuel Jr. was 12, still young enough to see the war as adventure rather than catastrophe. He wanted to fight, wanted to prove something, though what exactly he couldn't articulate. Marianne forbade it absolutely. She'd kept him alive this long, kept him free despite the constant danger of kidnapping, despite the laws that grew more restrictive every year. She wasn't going to lose him to a war that would kill hundreds of thousands before it ended. Georgia seceded in January 1861. By May, Confederate authorities were requisitioning supplies, labor, resources. They came to Marsh Grove demanding rice for the army, demanding enslaved workers to build fortifications around Savannah, demanding compliance from a woman who had no loyalty to their cause. Marianne gave them just enough to avoid immediate problems while hiding as much as she could. She reported fewer workers than actually lived on the plantation. She claimed crop failures that didn't exist. She paid bribes to local officials to look the other way. She became expert at surviving in a system that wanted to consume everything she'd built. The people still enslaved at Marsh Grove understood what was happening. They understood that Union victory would mean their freedom, that Confederate victory would mean perpetual bondage. Some wanted to run, to try to reach Union lines as they heard about other enslaved people doing. Marianne counseled patience, knowing that running was incredibly dangerous, that patrollers shot runaways on sight during wartime, that the roads were full of desperate men who would kidnap free black people and sell them for cash. Wait, she told them. I know it's hard. I know every day in bondage is torture, but the Union Army is coming. Sherman will march through Georgia eventually. When he does, freedom will come to you instead of you having to run toward it. Ruth, now in her 70s and freed in one of Marianne's early manumission groups, sat with her one evening in 1862 and spoke quietly. You know they hate you, don't you? The white people in Savannah, they hate that you're still here, still free, still wealthy when their world is burning. When the Confederacy falls, and it will fall, they're going to blame people like you for it. They're going to say enslaved people were happy until outsiders and traitors like you corrupted them. You need to be ready for that. I know, Marianne said. I've been hated my whole life. I can survive more of it. Can your children? That was the question that kept Marianne awake at night. Grace, Hope, and Samuel Jr. had grown up in a strange liminal space, legally free but socially invisible, educated but with no future in Georgia. Wealthy on paper but unable to display that wealth without attracting dangerous attention. They'd learned to be small, to be careful, to never draw the kind of notice that could get them killed or kidnapped or simply erased. But the war was making everything unstable, breaking the old rules without establishing new ones, and Marianne didn't know how to protect them in that chaos. In 1863, she made a decision. Grace was going north, Philadelphia, where Marianne had connections with the free black community, where a young woman of Grace's intelligence and education might actually build a life. Grace didn't want to go. She wanted to stay with her mother, wanted to see the war through, wanted to be present when the enslaved people on Marsh Grove finally gained their freedom. But Marianne insisted. "You have a chance I never had," she told her daughter. "A chance to be educated, to own yourself, to build something. I won't let you throw that away because you feel obligated to suffer alongside people you can't actually save. Go north, get established. When this is over, when the South is ashes and we're rebuilding, come back if you want. But right now, you need to survive." Grace left in March 1863, traveling with a family of free black people who were fleeing Georgia before conditions got worse. Marianne paid for her journey, gave her letters of introduction to people in Philadelphia, gave her enough money to establish herself. And then she watched her oldest daughter disappear down the road, not knowing if she'd ever see her again. Hope and Samuel Jr. stayed. They were too young to send north alone, and Marianne couldn't leave Marsh Grove without abandoning everyone who depended on her. So they stayed, and they waited, and they survived. The Union Army reached Savannah in December 1864. Sherman's march to the sea had carved a path of destruction through Georgia, burning plantations, freeing enslaved people, destroying the infrastructure that had supported the Confederacy. Marsh Grove was in the path. Marianne knew they were coming days before they arrived. Enslaved people brought news, whispered reports from other plantations, stories of blue-coated soldiers and freedom in their wake. When the Union troops finally reached Marsh Grove, Marianne did something no other plantation owner in Georgia did. She met them on the front porch with the plantation's freedom papers in her hands. "I'm Marianne Whitmore," she told the Union captain who led the detachment. "I own this plantation. These are the manumission papers for everyone who's already been freed. These are the names of everyone still held in bondage. As of this moment, under your authority, I'm declaring them all free. There are 147 people here who need to be registered as freed persons. I have food, shelter, and supplies. I'm offering this plantation as a staging area for your troops in exchange for protection while we transition to free labor." The captain stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. He'd burned a dozen plantations in the last month, places where owners fought or fled, places where enslaved people were discovered locked in barns or hidden in cellars. He'd never encountered someone like Marianne, someone who'd been enslaved herself, who now owned the plantation, who was actively cooperating with Union forces. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I'm going to need to see some documentation." She showed him everything. Samuel's will, the court rulings, the freedom papers, the financial records showing she'd been freeing people systematically, the ledgers proving she'd been paying wages even when it was illegal, the evidence that Marsh Grove had been something different from other plantations, not innocent, not free from the violence of the system, but at least trying to be less terrible than the alternatives. The captain read through it all and then looked at her with something like respect. "We'll accept your offer. My men need rest, and this plantation is in better condition than most we've seen. The freed people can stay if they want to work for wages, or they can leave. That's their choice now." The moment when the captain made the announcement, when he told the assembled people of Marsh Grove that they were legally free under federal authority, that they could stay or go, that they owned themselves now, was something Marianne would remember for the rest of her life. Some people cried. Some stood silent, unable to process what they'd just heard. Some laughed with a kind of desperate joy. Some simply walked away, wanting to test their freedom immediately, wanting to see if anyone would stop them. Ruth, now 75 years old, walked up to Marianne and took her hands. "You kept your promise," she said quietly. "Not the way you planned, not as fast as you wanted, but you kept it. They're free. The Union Army freed them," Marianne said. "I just helped. You did more than help. You could have been like every other owner, fighting to keep your property. Instead, you gave it away the moment you had the authority to do so. that matters. Over the following months, about half the freed people left Marsh Grove. They wanted to find family members who'd been sold away, or they wanted to see other parts of the country, or they simply wanted to distance themselves from the place they'd been enslaved, even if the woman who now owned it had once been enslaved herself. Marianne gave each person who left money for the journey, letters of recommendation, whatever help she could provide. The half who stayed negotiated contracts, real contracts, with wages and terms, and the understanding that they could leave if conditions weren't acceptable. It wasn't perfect. They were still working land that had been built by enslaved labor, still living in structures that carried the memory of bondage, still dealing with a woman who'd owned them just weeks earlier. But it was something. It was a step toward a different kind of relationship, toward something that looked less like ownership and more like employment, even if the history between them made every interaction complicated. Marianne converted Marsh Grove's operations entirely. No more rice monoculture. Instead, food crops that could support the people working the land, with surplus sold for cash that was distributed as wages. She divided some of the land into plots that workers could farm independently, keeping the profits from their own labor. She established a school in one of the old storage buildings, hiring a teacher from the north to educate the children who'd been deliberately kept illiterate under slavery. It was experimental, imperfect, constantly challenging. But it was also possibly the only plantation in Georgia that was trying to transform itself into something that wasn't based on exploitation. Whether it would survive economically, whether the social experiment would work, remained to be seen. Grace returned from Philadelphia in 1866. She'd spent 2 years establishing herself in the North, working as a teacher, building connections with abolitionists and women's rights advocates and people who were trying to imagine what Reconstruction could look like. She came back to Georgia because she wanted to be part of rebuilding, wanted to use her education to help freed people navigate their new reality. She started a school in Savannah for freed children. Hope joined her, and together they taught reading, arithmetic, history that didn't erase black people's experiences. They faced constant opposition, white Georgians who resented their presence, who hated seeing educated black women teaching other black people to read and think critically. But they also had support from the Freedmen's Bureau, from Northern missionary organizations, from the freed community itself that understood education was the path to real freedom. Samuel Jr. went north in 1867 to attend university. Oberlin College accepted him, one of the few institutions that would admit a young man of color. He studied law, planning to return to Georgia and help defend the legal rights that freed people were supposed to have, but that white Southerners were already working to undermine. Marianne stayed at Marsh Grove, managing the transformation, watching Reconstruction unfold with equal measures of hope and dread. Because even as federal troops enforced new laws, even as freed people voted for the first time, even as black men were elected to state legislatures, she could feel the resistance building. White Georgians who'd lost the war were already planning to win the peace, to restore white supremacy through violence and intimidation and legal manipulation. The Ku Klux Klan came to Marsh Grove in 1869. A dozen masked men, armed, demanding that Marianne stop teaching freed people to read, stop paying wages above what they considered appropriate, stop acting like she had the right to own property and make decisions. They burned one of the outbuildings as a warning. They told her that if she didn't comply, they'd burn the rest, and maybe her with it. Marianne stood on her porch with a rifle in her hands and told them to leave her property. She'd survived being enslaved, survived losing everything and building it back, survived a war and its aftermath. She wasn't going to be intimidated by men in sheets. They left that night, but she knew they'd be back. The violence that characterized Reconstruction Georgia was just beginning, and it would only get worse. Freed people were being murdered for trying to vote, for negotiating wages, for acting like they were actually free. Schools were being burned. Teachers were being driven out. Everything the war was supposed to have ended was reasserting itself in new forms. By 1870, Marianne made another hard decision. She sold Marsh Grove, not to local whites who wanted to restore the old order, but to the freed people who'd been working it. She divided the land into parcels and sold them at below-market rates to families who'd spent their lives working that land in bondage and who now had the chance to own it. She kept a small portion for herself, 100 acres with the main house, enough to support her in her aging years. The rest she distributed, creating a community of black landowners in coastal Georgia. The sale was controversial. White Georgians saw it as race betrayal, saw it as encouraging black independence, saw it as everything they feared about Reconstruction. Some of the freed people who bought land faced immediate violence, nighttime raids, fires, threats. But enough of them survived. Enough held onto their property through Reconstruction and beyond, that by the 1880s, there was a community of black farmers in that part of Georgia who owned their own land free and clear. Mary Ann lived until 1891. She died at 66 years old, having survived 66 years in a country that had been hostile to her existence from the moment she was born. She was buried on the portion of marsh grove she'd kept in a small cemetery where she'd buried Samuel 37 years earlier. Her headstone read simply, Mary Ann Cheswick Whitmore. Born free, enslaved, freed again, she kept her promises. Grace became a prominent educator, running schools for freed people across the South until her death in 1920. She never married, dedicating her life to teaching, to fighting for women's suffrage, to working with organizations that supported civil rights. She wrote a memoir in 1895 that documented her family's story, though it wasn't published until 1925, after her death, and even then only in limited circulation. The book was called Between Two Worlds, and it told the truth about what it meant to be the child of an enslaved woman and a wealthy white man, to grow up legally free but socially impossible, to inherit wealth built on slavery while trying to use that wealth to end slavery's legacy. Hope married a minister and had 5 children. She taught them to read, taught them their grandmother's story, taught them that freedom was something you fought for every single day. Her descendants scattered across the country, becoming teachers, doctors, lawyers, building lives that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. Some of them kept records, kept the documentation that proved their connection to the Whitmore fortune, kept the story alive through generations. Samuel Jr. became one of Georgia's first black lawyers. He defended freed people whose land was being stolen, whose rights were being violated, whose freedom was being eroded by black codes and Jim Crow laws that replaced slavery with only slightly less oppressive systems. He was disbarred in 1898 when Georgia changed its laws to prevent black lawyers from practicing. He moved north and continued his work there, fighting for civil rights until his death in 1932. Elizabeth Whitmore lived until 1889, dying in Charleston at the age of 75. She never remarried. She never spoke about Samuel or the will or the scandal that had destroyed her life. She maintained her dignity, maintained her position in Charleston society through sheer force of will and her family connections. Her children inherited nothing from Samuel's fortune, but they survived on Elizabeth's dower money and their own work. They were respectable, if not wealthy, white Southerners who did their best to forget that their father had chosen another family over them. The two families never reconciled. Grace and Hope never met their half-brothers James and Thomas. The children of Samuel Whitmore grew up in completely separate worlds, divided by race and choice and the poison of a system that had corrupted every human relationship it touched. The story of Mary Ann Whitmore and Samuel's will was mostly forgotten. It didn't fit the narratives that either side wanted to tell after the Civil War. The South wanted to remember benevolent masters and happy enslaved people, wanted to forget about men who fathered children in bondage and women who fought for freedom through the courts. The North wanted to remember heroic abolitionists and simple narratives of liberation, wanted to forget about the complicated compromises and moral ambiguities that characterized most people's actual experiences. But the documents survived. Court records, the will itself, financial ledgers, Grace's memoir, letters between family members, deeds showing land transfers from Mary Ann to freed people, all of it preserved in archives, in courthouse basements, in boxes stored in attics, waiting for historians to piece together the truth. Because the truth is always more complicated than the stories we tell. Samuel Whitmore wasn't a hero for trying to free the woman he'd enslaved and acknowledging the children he'd owned. He was a man who participated in an evil system while trying to minimize his own participation, who loved a woman but kept her in bondage, who freed his children, but only after his death meant he wouldn't have to face the social consequences of doing so. He did better than most men in his position, but that's a low bar to clear when the baseline is owning human beings. Mary Ann wasn't a simple victim who passively accepted her situation until Samuel freed her. She was someone who survived through intelligence and adaptation, who became complicit in managing a plantation system in order to protect herself and her children, who used the limited power she could access to help others while also acknowledging that having that power made her part of the system she hated. She did the best she could with impossible choices, but that doesn't erase the fact that she owned enslaved people for several years, that she had to operate within structures of violence to survive. Elizabeth wasn't just a villain who fought to keep Marianne enslaved. She was a woman who'd been used by a man who never loved her, who'd devoted her life to a marriage that was a lie, who'd done everything society told her to do and got punished for it anyway. Her fight to contest the will wasn't just about money or racism, though both played roles. It was about the fundamental unfairness of a system that gave women no real power except through their husbands, and then took even that derivative power away when men made different choices. There are no clean stories in American slavery. No simple heroes and villains. No easy answers to questions about complicity and resistance and survival. Only people trying to navigate a system designed to destroy them, making choices that were never simple, living with consequences that rippled forward through generations. The Whitmore case exposed all of this in public. It forced a courtroom full of wealthy Georgians to examine questions they preferred to ignore. What happens when enslaved people are also people you love? What happens when your children are property? What happens when the system you've built your life on suddenly collapses and forces you to acknowledge its fundamental evil? These weren't theoretical questions in 1854. They were real people's lives, real families torn apart, real consequences that nobody could escape, and the questions didn't end when slavery did. They continued through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights Movement, through to today. What do we owe the descendants of enslaved people? How do we acknowledge inherited wealth that was built on stolen labor? How do we reconcile the fact that many of us are descended from both enslaved people and enslavers? That the violence of slavery created family trees that branch in impossible directions? How do we tell the truth about our history when that truth implicates everyone? Marsh Grove Plantation still exists. Most of the original property was sold off over the decades, developed into housing and commercial space. But the main house stands, preserved as a historical site. Tour guides tell visitors about the architecture, about the rice cultivation methods, about the economic importance of coastal Georgia agriculture. Sometimes they mention Samuel Whitmore and his controversial will. Rarely do they tell the full story of Marianne, of the legal battle that exposed slavery's contradictions, of the freed community that briefly flourished on that land before being driven out by violence and Jim Crow. But the records exist. The truth is there for anyone willing to look for it. And in that truth is a story about America that we still don't know how to tell. A story about how systems of oppression corrupt everyone they touch, how people can be victims and perpetrators simultaneously, how there are no simple answers when every choice is made within structures of violence. Marianne Whitmore died having freed herself and helped others free themselves. She turned a plantation into a community of landowners. She raised children who became teachers and lawyers and activists. She did everything possible to transform the inheritance Samuel left her into something that served justice rather than perpetuating oppression. But she also spent years managing enslaved labor. She made decisions about which people to free and which to keep waiting. She operated within a system she hated because that was the only way to survive it. She became wealthy through structures of exploitation even as she tried to dismantle those structures. There's no version of this story where anyone emerges with clean hands. That's the real horror of American slavery. Not just that it was violent and cruel and stolen people's lives, though it was all of those things, but that it poisoned everything it touched so completely that even resistance to it required becoming complicit in it. Even love within it was corrupted by it. Even attempts at justice had to work through its structures and therefore reinforce them. The case of Samuel, Whitmore's will forced all of that into the open. For one brief moment in 1854, it made visible what usually stayed hidden. It asked questions that had no good answers. And then history moved on, the Civil War came, and the moment passed. But the questions remain. They're still with us, still unresolved, still demanding answers we don't know how to give. What do we do with inherited wealth built on exploitation? How do we acknowledge both the humanity of people trapped in evil systems and the evil of the systems themselves? How do we tell stories about our past that are honest about everyone's complicity without erasing anyone's suffering? These aren't just historical questions. They're about how we understand ourselves, our families, our country, They're about whether we can face the truth of where we come from without being destroyed by that truth. They're about whether redemption is possible for crimes this deep, this old, this foundational to everything we've built. There are no easy answers. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the real lesson of Marianne Whitmore's story isn't that she found redemption or justice or peace. It's that she kept trying anyway, kept fighting for something better even when better was still terrible, kept making choices even when every choice was impossible. Maybe that's all any of us can do when we inherit systems we didn't create but can't escape. Keep trying. Keep fighting. Keep telling the truth even when the truth is complicated and uncomfortable and implicates everyone, including ourselves. Keep working towards something better, even if we never fully get there. The sealed room where these stories lived, where uncomfortable truths were locked away and deliberately forgotten, is opening now. Not easily, not completely, but enough that we can see inside. Enough that we can acknowledge what happened, who suffered, who survived, who fought, who failed. Enough that we can maybe finally start having honest conversations about the inheritance we all carry. The wealth and the guilt, the survival and the complicity, the love and the violence, all of it together, inseparable, ours. What do you think? Could Marianne have done anything differently? Was Samuel's final act redemption or just more cruelty disguised as conscience? Is it possible to use wealth built on evil for good purposes? Or does that wealth always carry its poison forward? And what do we owe the descendants of people like Marianne, whose freedom was fought for in courtrooms while their humanity was still being debated? Leave your thoughts below. These stories matter because they're true, because they reveal the foundations our country was built on, because we can't move forward without understanding where we came from. If this story made you think, made you uncomfortable, made you want to know more about the histories that were deliberately erased, subscribe to The Sealed Room. Hit that notification bell because we're opening doors that powerful people spent centuries trying to keep locked. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments what other buried stories from American history you want us to uncover. The past is never dead. It's not even past. It's here with us, in the wealth we inherit, in the systems we navigate, in the choices we make about what stories to tell and which ones to bury. Let's keep telling the truth, no matter how complicated it is.